Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about higher education in Puerto Rico, conditions and context, influencing institutional resilience. We are honored to have with us several colleagues who have been involved in higher education in Puerto Rico for many years and who we turn to and continue to learn from as an organization and work that matters as we pay attention to students and institutions and the things we need to pay attention to for our community on the island as well as the mainland. So we have our colleagues who are very esteemed, have lots of experience overall, but for the purposes of getting to a conversation, they've allowed me to be very brief in sharing their current titles. And what I'd like to suggest is that you go to our website to look at their bios in more detail once we have the webinar up and running, so you can see the experience and the knowledge of our colleagues in much deeper experience overall. I'd like to start by sharing, I am Deborah Santiago. I am the co-founder and CEO for Excelencia in Education. We're an organization that has been around for 17 years with a mission to accelerate Latino student success in higher education. And for us, being in Washington, DC, make sure we're paying attention to student profiles, their strengths, needs, and make sure that we do so not to the exclusion of others, but to make sure we're paying attention to the opportunities we have to make sure all of our students are served intentionally and well. With me, we have Margarita Benítez, who's the executive director of the Fundación Puertorriqueña de las Humanidades, who is, yes, they are next to us here. And then we have Hilda Colón, who is a educational consultant and has a great vast experience. And I said I was going to share a sentence and then I forgot. My apologies. Margarita is the executive director of the Puerto Rico Humanities Endowment, a respected and influential organization that enables cultural initiatives on the island, ranging from documentaries to colloquia, publications, and cultural celebrations. My apologies, Margarita. And Hilda Colón has served as the chancellor of the University of Puerto Rico, Humacao, from 2002 to 2009. And that's where she started her higher education career. She served as the vice president for institutional field relations at the Middle States Commission on Higher Education in Philadelphia until 2020, and is now a consultant in education. And our third colleague joining us is José Caraballo, and he is the associate professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Cayey, where he is also a researcher in the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research and director of the Census Information Center of Puerto Rico. And I keep moving my mouse and it keeps moving it around. So my apologies to all of you. Hopefully you can see this here. And I'm being told that I need to link myself as a presenter, pin myself, which is what I'm going to try to do right now. The beauty of technical issues as we go forward. So before we get started and ask our colleagues questions and engage in this discussion about the context and the condition in Puerto Rico today in higher education, I wanted to raise a quick comment to talk about why Excelencia in Education is taking a look at Puerto Rico. And in our 17 years, we've always included Puerto Rico in all of our research and our data. For those of you that know Excelencia in Education, it's been key. Too often, we find that there's a great deal of ignorance about the island and those that come from the island, as well as the condition of higher education on the island. I hope all of you who are here know that every student and everyone who is in Puerto Rico that is a US citizen at birth. And so paying attention to the institutions on the island and the students and the faculty and staff and administrators who are working on the island is key and core to how we think about higher education and the community, the broader Latino community in this country. And that means that we have to think about the policies and practices and investments and strategies on the island as well. So all of those are important as we think about this. So from Excelencia's perspective, you can't have a complete picture and view of Latinos in the United States without paying attention to what is happening in Puerto Rico. And that's been core from our understanding. And one of the reasons why we wanted to have this kind of conversation with all of you. We were fortunate enough last year to get some support from Sandium Education Group to take a look at the scan, environmental scan of the condition and context of higher education in Puerto Rico. And that is the content that spurs our thinking and wants us to get going as we think about this effort. So we actually have a poll that we would want you all to engage in to see a little bit about what you might know about higher education in Puerto Rico. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind starting a poll for us. Great. So what you see here are 3 simple questions that we hope will just, we'll dig deeper and deeper with our colleagues to learn and talk a little bit more about higher education in Puerto Rico. First, if you all would please respond to the poll. How many total colleges and universities are in Puerto Rico? How many 2-year institutions are in Puerto Rico? And the third, how many students are enrolled in post-secondary education in Puerto Rico? Some very basic, simple, descriptive statistics, just to get a sense of those of you who are with us and what you know. See, we've got about half of attendees who have responded so far. Thank you for engaging, trying to make it a little bit of an interactive session. Good. Great, we've got about 100 folks. Thank you for checking it out. I think, Emily, if you might be able to share with us some of the, end the poll and see if we can find some of the responses here.
Sure, absolutely. So for the answers for the 3 questions are as follows. So for the first, total colleges and universities, more than 80. So all of you that answered the third question, the third answer, of those, how many 2-year institutions are in Puerto Rico? And the answer is 14. So answer the first choice. And lastly, how many students enrolled in post-secondary education in Puerto Rico? And that would be the last one. More than 150,000 students are enrolled.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. It looks like we have some good amount of knowledge here by attendees. That's great for us to know as presenters that are looking to make sure to engage with you overall. So I think we want to get to the heart of and talk to our 3 colleagues a little bit more about what we know about the condition and context in higher education. And what I'd like to do is to get us started by thinking overall, if you could share 1 or 2 points, facts about higher education in Puerto Rico, what would that be? And I'm going to give you that as a prompt while I share a little bit of slides we have that complement the poll. So want you guys to be ready. What are 1 or 2 facts you want the audience to know, given what you saw in the poll and what we're sharing with you? Again, some of the findings we're sharing here are takeaways from our environmental scan that is available on our website. So these are 3 or 4 points that Excelencia pulled out as we wait for our colleagues to share with us. First, the total population in K12 educational pipeline has declined on the island, and that could be affecting the future college-going pool of applicants. And that's significantly important given the economic situation, given the goals we have as a country to make sure we have a well-educated citizenry, workforce, leadership effort overall. Second, our data show that full-time retention rates have increased in the last 15 years in colleges and universities in Puerto Rico, despite there being drops in enrollment. And in fact, these retention rates are higher than the national retention rate on the mainland. Third, the cost of attendance across all sectors on the island has been increasing over the last 20 years. And there is a significant gap between the students' cost of attendance and the financial aid, specifically the grant aid they receive. And we know in How Latinos Pay for College work that Excelencia has done that grant aid is significantly important for our community, especially on the island. And then we look at graduation rates. They've been on the rise at private 4-year institutions, but they've remained relatively stagnant at public 4-year institutions overall. And part of the reason we took a look at that is, as we shared earlier in the poll, the vast majority of institutions on the island are 4-year institutions. And the last point is that despite an increasing share of the population attaining a post-secondary degree, Puerto Rico's unemployment rate is high. Okay, so that's a little bit of our thinking about this. Please know that we are going to be paying attention. We've got lots of questions based on that environmental scan that we are looking to explore with case studies that we're doing in partnership with the Fundación that we hope we'll be able to get into much more detail. The purpose of this conversation now is to turn to our colleagues and get a perspective from them. So I gave you a little bit of that thinking here, colleagues, and asking if you could share one or two important facts about higher education in Puerto Rico. What would that be? And we'll start with you, Jose.
Sure. I will say that most of the institutions in Puerto Rico are accredited by the Middle State Commission. And secondly, most of the private universities in Puerto Rico are teaching oriented. Most of the research that is done in Puerto Rico, academic research, is done in the public university.
Great, interesting facts. Thank you, Jose. Hilda, from your perspective, just one or two facts as we get started in this conversation.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you who are sharing this conversation with us. I would say quickly that even though the cost of attendance has been rising, it's still a diverse higher education, I call it ecosystem, and it's still affordable compared to the cost, for example, in the mainland. So this is very important in terms of resiliency and probabilities for the future. And there's also a great appreciation, as Jose was also mentioning, for professional and institutional accreditation in Puerto Rico, and the institutions show that all across the spectrum.
Oh, interesting. So we've talked a little bit about data, public institutions, research. Yes, certainly resilience is important, and as we think about the role and the contributions that go beyond just enrollment and attention. Margarita, if you could highlight just one or two things that you think are important from a data perspective about the island, what would you share?
I think there's been a realignment that is still underway of strategies, student focus, and investment in higher education throughout all sectors. We were used to thinking that the public sector, and we think so in the United States, focuses mostly in the low-income populations. That is not necessarily the case. In Puerto Rico, it bears closer examination. And the adaptations that the private institutions have made in the past 10 or 12 years are really fascinating to watch, to study. So I would say, challenging circumstances call for unexpected or at least unusual measures. And that certainly has been happening in Puerto Rico, as I'm sure we'll document throughout our conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Margarita. I think this idea of what is it we know about higher education on the mainland, and does it hold, and what is unique, or how do we need to think about higher education on the island that's authentic to the island, and how they've pivoted and adjusted is core to this conversation. So thank you each for sharing something. I know it's going to be hard because you all are so knowledgeable about higher education, but I'm going to push a little bit of our thinking for those of you who are in attendance, and make sure we cover some of the topics that Jose, Hilda, and Margarita have raised, as we try to make sure that we are more aware of what's happening on the island. So let me start with you, Jose. So we know you work a great deal with data. Thank you for being a fellow data nerd. It's lovely. What are the implications from your perspective of the significant demographic shifts and migration patterns for education in Puerto Rico?
Yes, I would like to ask you if you see my screen right now.
Yes.
Yes, so here we have data from the US Census Bureau that also the American Community Survey that is done in the US is also done in the island. And so we are able to track migration patterns in and out from Puerto Rico. So here you observe that in the last decades, there has been a significant out-migration, but Hurricane Maria changed these numbers. You see that a lot of people migrate in that year. These are fiscal years, but then there was an incoming migration. So that just led me to conclude that many of these people, these are returning migrants from Hurricane Maria. So if you migrate as a refugee from Puerto Rico, you are, I don't know, an old person that lives alone in the island. So your your children say, come over here, then you return because you didn't have that decision to migrate permanently. But what we observed during the last year is that a significant drop from the migration levels that we observed before Hurricane Maria. And that's because of the reconstruction that is taking place in the island. The economy has been growing a little bit, except when the pandemic hits, and that has been affecting the outmigration that we observed before Maria. So I have here some numbers from migrating students from the department public system, the public education system in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Department of Education. And you can see the level of students that have been migrating have been declining, except for the year that was impacted by Hurricane Maria. So during the last few years, the number of out-migrants have been declining relatively to the pre-Maria levels.
And also, if I could just probe a little bit more on that, is that what are the implications from your perspective of looking at those data as we think about higher education on the island?
Well, I think that the declining number that the many higher education centers in the island observed before Hurricane Maria is going to continue, but it's not going to be as high as we observed before Maria. We are right now more or less expecting what is going to occur after reconstruction, because if the economy drops once again, what we can expect is that the out-migration increase one more time. So I think that the institutions here in the island have to start to look more on how to export their services. So how you can attract more students from abroad, especially from Latin America, that they want to come to study in Puerto Rico, and in a way to substitute the students that you used to have in the good days in the past few decades.
Great, thank you, Jose. Very provocative in thinking about what the numbers mean. I think so many folks are still thinking about Hurricane Maria and the out-migration of so many of our students, and not realizing that as some of the community are coming back, what that means for the institutions and the K12 system that's trying to make sure they get educated and get a quality education. So thank you for that, Jose. In that same vein, I want to add now, Hilda, and asking you, you've led accreditation issues, and you raised that even in your quick fact. But you've led accreditation efforts for many years on the island and with institutions on the island. How have colleges and universities managed the financial pressures or the economic challenges in Puerto Rico? And how have you seen that in accreditation?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, colleges and universities in general in Puerto Rico have been remarkably efficient in overcoming the financial challenges that have been posed by both internal and external factors. And there's where the affordability observation comes from. The higher education public system in Puerto Rico usually had a high dependency, still has a high dependency on the governmental funds that it usually received on a yearly basis. It was about 9% of the total budget of the government of Puerto Rico, so it was significant. Even today, I received some slides courtesy of one of my good friends that were produced by the Center for Nueva Economía, el Centro para la Nueva Economía, in which they once again reiterate the fact that we all know about the public sector, and that is how the decline in funds, in governmental funds, has gone from the amounts that they were receiving, the public system in 2016, 17, to at this point, it's a loss of 52% approximately. So that is significantly high for any kind of system. It will unbalance, anything. If you lose that amount of money, that amount of your budgetary expectations within 3 years or 4 years, and you have the horrible conditions that we have been living through. The government of Puerto Rico is bankrupt. We have the Promesa, the financial board, and we have to live with those realities. So within that context, the public system, and that includes the University of Puerto Rico, The public system includes the public sector includes the Conservatorio de Música. It includes the Escuela de Artes Plásticas. That's what I'm talking about, not just the University of Puerto Rico as a system, but the whole encompassing set of institutions that depend on the government of Puerto Rico for their budgetary needs, have suffered tremendously. So the fact that they're still operating, the fact that they're still working and producing graduates means that they have found ways to try to survive. Of course, the University of Puerto Rico has been slowly reducing that gap, mostly through attrition and adjustments in costs. They still, in my opinion, need to look at themselves and reach important decisions towards the future. In terms of the private sector, which is bigger, much bigger in terms of numbers and the diversity of institutions, and certainly there are 46 Middle States accredited institutions in Puerto Rico, whereas the rest are not accredited by Middle States. So in fact, it's a majority that are not accredited by Middle States. That's interesting because we all used to think that that's the case and it's not. And then, so those are making strides in several interesting, very interesting ways that I would love to have more opportunity to express, but I really know that we don't have the time. But there's creativity. There's a terrible loss and pain also within the budgetary situation.
Right. Thank you. Well, I think you've dropped a good point for us to follow up with in subsequent questions, which we will have here. And we hope that this won't be the last conversation we have about this overall. So thank you. I think you've queued us up in thinking a little bit more about just a smidgen of what the institutions are having to deal with financially as it deals with accreditation and others. Let me pivot quickly to Margarita, and then I think we want to return to some of these issues that both Jose you've raised and Hilda you've raised, but also getting a little more context from Margarita. You know, you've well known, and we all have so much respect for you. You've led efforts in Puerto Rico, as well as on the mainland here. How are colleges and universities in Puerto Rico perceived on the mainland, given your experience in working in both? And from your perspective, what's the role of the diaspora here on the mainland?
I'm glad. Let me start with the diaspora, because that is a topic that fascinates me, and it is a topic in which we have all been involved personally and professionally in multiple dimensions. Right now, of course, there's 3 generations of Puerto Ricans living in the United States, those who left in the great migrations of the 50s and in subsequent years, and of course, the very recent group that has just left that Jose was documenting. And for some of them, English is the language of life and instruction, and for others, English is a foreign language that you have to jump your way through trying to, and that of course makes a difference in terms of teaching strategies, methods, opportunities, possibilities. But one thing that I want to say before anything else is that Puerto Rico has no greater friend than the Puerto Rican diaspora. In politics, in higher education, in opportunities for those of us who come later or for a shorter period, their advocacy, their loyalty, their trust in Puerto Rico is something that I have experienced again and again, whether it's expressed in Spanish or in English. And those, I repeat, are the best allies our island and our country can hope to have. Having said that, and of course, Deborah, you know that well, that's been your own experience, and you have been a great friend to Puerto Rico. Having said that, then, we are talking about a number of educational challenges for the diaspora. And depending, of course, on whether they are the recent arrivals that have to make their way into a system that is not familiar to them, or whether it's people who speak the language of minorities. And to be a minority in the United States, as we know, is an experience hard to believe if you haven't lived it. So in that respect, I want to say that every possible question or every possible challenge in higher education has been faced by people in the diaspora, depending, of course, on their own level of advancement and their own level of understanding, a very significant role that Puerto Rico universities could play. We tried modestly. Hilda and I have worked in a number of projects through the years, some of them with the Ana Mendez system, others with Polytechnic University, have been to ease the way of the diaspora, the recent departees from Puerto Rico into the US system. That is to establish connections, to establish collaboration agreements, to establish convalidation agreements, so that students don't have to start from zero, and so that their experience and their previous work counts for something. We should be doing a lot more of that, and I certainly hope Excelencia can help us identify models that work, because there are many, many students of all ages. The other thing we're seeing is the reduction of the traditional college age population. Students of all ages who started and never finished, and who need a credential in order to get ahead. And that is a role that Puerto Rico universities can play to the fullest. And I have to say, in all honesty, that they haven't yet, but that we see signs of an awakening, partly driven by the drop in enrollments, which all of a sudden makes all other companions look particularly interesting and agreeable. But for whatever reason, I think this is a time in which we must strengthen the links and the bonds and the collaboration efforts between mainland and Puerto Rico institutions.
Thank you. Well, and you know, when you take a look at the environmental scan that we did, Margarita, to your point, we took a look at age, we took a look at what is the profile, not just of current students, but the potential set of students that can be coming through. And your point of not just looking at the traditional pipeline, as important as that is, but that kind of post-traditional pipeline of those that might have started out and stopped, swirled, moved around, maybe been to the mainland and come back. That's an important population that also needs to get served. And I think that's part of the story we need to tell about the island and the opportunities institutions have in their own resilience. Speaking of kind of prepping students to go into college, Jose, you had shared a little bit of data with us and taking a look, especially at the educational pipeline, when we had a conversation, and that I think drew your attention in the environmental scan. How has the K12 the closing of K12 schools on the island over the last several years affected access to opportunity and college preparation of potential college students?
Yes, I should say that I'm the co-director of the Public Education Observatory in the island. I'm going to put in the chat the link. So if you want to have to see the reports that we have been doing, including one that I did about the impact of the schools that were closed in the island in the last couple of years. What was the impact on academic achievement? So I found, using data, that a third of the public schools in the island were closed in just 3 years, from 2017 to 2020. And that caused a decline in academic achievement when we measure it through a standardized test, as we did in the past. So we compare before and after the closing, and that's what we found. And so in that sense, you're going to have a cohort of students here in the island, or a couple of cohorts, that are going to have less academic skills than previous generations. So when these children become adults and go into college, are going to be less prepared than previous generation that went to college. So you might ask why the government here closed a third of the public schools. Well, we are right now in the middle of a very intense austerity because of the debt crisis that Puerto Rico is having right now. So that's one of the ways that the government and the Fiscal Control Board are attempting to fix the budget in the island.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if those of you that have been following this, has been an issue for quite a while. I have the good fortune, I have one of my cousins who is a teacher on the island, has been for 30 odd years, and the challenges of being a teacher when your local school closes, and where you can go to make sure you provide a quality education it's real. It's not something esoteric. And we know we've been doing some work looking at rural places across the US and mainland, and we see similar efforts where there is constriction of K-12 availability, and what that means for opportunities in college preparation is significant. So thank you, Jose. Pushing that, thinking about the pathway and the pipeline a little bit, Hilda, we know that, as you had shared earlier, that Puerto Rico has public and private systems, not just institutions, but systems overall. And how do university systems, from your perspective, public and private, how do they balance their role in providing access to quality education between rural areas, places like Utuado, if you get the University of Puerto Rico, a very small place, with metropolitan areas like Rio Piedras? How do systems do that when you have an island that is small but has a great deal of rural and urban areas combined?
Well, that's very important. Thank you for the question. It really goes a little bit beyond the scope of the study, because this is not necessarily a scan, but in reasons why. Why do the universities decide to go into this area? What are the academic implications of establishing a campus here or there? There are so many intricate factors working out at the same time. The University of Puerto Rico, as well as the private university system, ecosystem, I'm talking about the whole amount of universities, have been trying to look specifically, creating niche spots of opportunity, centers that we don't necessarily repeat what is offered at any other institution in the island. That was the reason, for example, for Utuado. It was the agricultural aspect and the development of the center of everything that was related to what's happening in the center of the island. I would say that I would argue that, for example, I may mention at this point that if I want a good example of how to balance and mention the efforts of higher education institutions in Puerto Rico in terms of the needs of the places where they are established, I would say that I would look, instead of UPR Utuado, and this is gonna cost me, I'm gonna look at Inter-American University, for example, in Barranquitas. They have been they're right there in the middle of the mountains in Puerto Rico, and they have been doing specific work, for example, and they have now a PhD in biotechnology. Can you imagine that? In the center of the island, a private institution has this program, the only one with this focus in Puerto Rico, and it's doing wonders. I mean, they have really looked at their context. They have really looked at the needs of the population. They have decided, we're gonna fill a gap. We're gonna fill a need. And that way, it closes the differences between the coastal metropolitan region and the mountains. So I know that, and many other institutions, and I know that we have representatives here from the different schools of medicine, for example. It's a PhD doctor. And it's from many institutions in the island. We have schools of medicine. We have a school of chiropractors. We have, that's in a private institution. We have interesting programs that are being moved by other private medical schools as well as, so they have been really looking with intensity at the needs and trying to find specialized places in which to best develop their capabilities and serve the population. Much more, I would say, that it really hurts me, much more than my own institution, the University of Puerto Rico.
So that's an interesting way of thinking, that systems are trying to figure out where to
fit
skills and knowledge so that it serves the island overall and not just in the metropolitan area. So that's interesting. And the choices that need to get made from an accreditation perspective and the levels between undergraduate and graduate.
That's fantastic, in my opinion. It brings the doctorates right there to the center of the island.
That's powerful. Thank you. And there's a lot more to unpack with each one of these and some reasons why, and as we look forward. So, but thank you for Hilda for pointing that out. Turning to you, Margarita, because you've worked in both areas and led institutions and efforts in both of those, part of the subtext of this webinar is looking at institutional resilience and comparing or understanding what we could learn, not just from the mainland, but also from the island. So from your perspective, how can institutional resilience in Puerto Rico inform mainland institutions and the work they're trying to do? Oh, I'm sorry, I need to unmute you. I'm going to ask you to unmute. I'm sorry. There we go. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, sure. Well, let's look at parallel situations. What do you do after a major hurricane? Unfortunately, a number of institutions in the US have had to confront that experience. And unfortunately, we in Puerto Rico have experience about some of the things that should be done, especially when others come to offer help. Because there's nothing more frustrating than to want to be helpful in a situation and not to be able to assist, partly because the receiving institution doesn't have a clear idea of what it needs or how to channel the goodwill and the efforts. And in that respect, we are guilty of some of that, I can tell you, because I was in the States when Maria hit Puerto Rico, and I was instrumental in transmitting offers of assistance from US schools to Puerto Rican institutions. And of course, they were saying, carajo, we just got our roof blown off, and you're calling me from Arizona State University. Yes, because Arizona State can help you. But I mean, so one of the things is that these arrangements have to be worked out in advance. And by now, we know enough about the damage hurricanes can cause to also know how we need to be assisted. And there are, of course, the immediate recovery and build up physical plan kind of things. But then there's also, what do you do with your students and where can they go? Now, it's important to have built a relationship based on trust, because otherwise, what you will find and what I witnessed with Maria is that some of the schools were reluctant to share their student data with US institutions because they were concerned that they might be predatory and want to keep them. And some of our most generous friends, people like Zulma Toro and Wabet Cruzado, former chancellor and former dean in Mayagüez, offered tuition free for students from Puerto Rico so that they could complete their semester. And not everybody was willing to share the information because they thought they might keep them, which, anyway. So that's certainly one way in which we can be helpful. And the other one is to really take a good look, as we were saying earlier, to the whole transfer and validation. It's not necessarily a formal transfer. Then what kind of, what is the point of the realm? What do you need and how can you clear up the paper trail that typically makes students just so upset that finally they give up? So those are two areas. And then the third one, this business of micro-credentials and all these opportunities for, abbreviated but credit-bearing experiences is also something that could be very helpful and where we can learn from each other, because there are a few things that we are doing in Puerto Rico that are, I think, worth taking a second look at. And then there's all the experience of many schools in the States that live and have developed 10 and 20 years experience in terms of micro-credentials. Their time has come. So it's a matter of learning from each other.
Right. Thank you. And, so often, too rarely do we think about the institutions on the island as being the trendsetters and those that have figured some of things out that can inform the mainland, right? Often it's the other way around and we're looking to import these kinds of things. So I appreciate how concretely you've been able to identify by three things that can be actionable right away. I know we also, the work we're trying to do together is taking a look at from a implementation perspective and the institutional resilience from finances, enrollment, and strategy, paying attention to how institutions that have seen a multitude of challenges, how they've been able to pivot and adjust in ways and while keeping students in mind in ways that can be sustaining. And certainly Hilda mentioned something about, looking at rural and urban. What does that mean when you have a system that has to support and sustain? What is, what do you call it? The economic mobility and opportunity of our community and the resources needed. So I think you've raised 3 very concrete ones, and there's many more we hope to be able to articulate in our work together. But you've all raised some very interesting points for us to consider. And I guess, I always like to ask folks, if you had a magic wand and if money weren't an issue, 2 big caveats, I will admit, but part of this is thinking through how to dream and see what's possible and how do we work towards it. So maybe let me start with you, Jose, and ask you if you could recommend investments in the educational pathway for students in Puerto Rico. What would you prioritize in terms of investments?
Well, if it's investment coming from the government, I will recommend the government to individualize education in Puerto Rico. There are quite a lot of students. Actually, I'm going to give you the number right now because I'm writing a paper about something related. You have almost 13% of the students in Puerto Rico have a specific learning problems. That's the category that they are in the special education program. So if you individualize education in the public schools, teachers are able to bring the specific materials to these children that have a specific learning problems, but at the same time you are able to address the rest of your student population. But if you have a big number, which is the target of the Fiscal Control Board, to have more than 25 of a student per teacher, it's going to be very hard for the teachers to address the needs of these students. I repeat, 13% of the student body have a specific learning problems, and if we don't address them, the probability that they're going to drop out is higher. So that's what I will say to the government. In the case of NGOs, I will recommend them to support the work that is being done by many research organizations in Puerto Rico, and sometimes it's very hard for them to find funding because many of the big national agencies in the US, they don't find very attractive the case of Puerto Rico. So sometimes you need to make you need to become a lawyer instead of a researcher, and ask them, hey, the case of Puerto Rico is important for the US because this and that. And I will say that we need more research, so the government stop taking decisions based on anecdotes or in comments that they see here and there, and in that way we can help more the students in the island and improve the education. That's what we need, not just as a cultural thing, which is important, but also it is important for economic development to have a better education in the island.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I think that being able to parse it out that way and looking at the kinds of investment are significantly important. We have found the ignorance about the island is very large, and the ability to invest in the kind of research that can clarify from stereotypes and old profiles to current. One of the reasons we put the scan together, but so much the work you're doing and other faculty and folks on the island are so important. We need to bring attention to this critical work as we think about the effort going forward. I'd ask you, Hilda, the same question. If you could recommend investments in the educational pathway for students in Puerto Rico, what would you prioritize?
Oh, that's one of the questions I would really enjoy. I'm going to tell you this. I would prioritize, certainly what Jose just mentioned,
yeah,
student support. We need to emphasize, prioritize student support in all ways. That's from, and I would say looking at educational pathway, starting in middle school, getting our focus in middle school. As I looked at the scan, that's where I think that the biggest gap is, and that's where I think we need to focus specifically and try to move that path, that those students in the pipeline towards the university, so that it could be a seamless operation based on needs. And for that, we need to start thinking in a different way in terms of university and the school system collaborations or operations. It should be a pathway, a real pathway, a seamless flow. I believe in alliances. So I would put money, governmental money, in creating, fostering alliances. That's, I mean, when I was a chancellor at the University of Puerto Rico, Macau for 7 years. We created, and people who are here in this conversation know that we foster them, enhance them. I think that if we work together, we can get better understanding of each other and respect the work that everything that I need, I can propose to you, and you can, as on your side, propose to us. They work. I think that we would need to be ready for reviews and politically strong academic reviews and curricular renovations in order to make those seamless alliances work. So it's not looking at the curriculum of a program just like, okay, we move this course from here to there. It's just not a rearrangement of the curriculum. It's really thinking through what is it that we need at this point. That needs support, that needs money to be done, specialists, and a new way of thinking. And there's also, I think, we need to use money in investment for what Jose was just mentioning, quality pilot studies, such as the one that we're examining today, so that we can expand our vision, look through models, and we need support. The government shouldn't be excluded from this effort. And I think that we also need to support serious strategic planning in Puerto Rico, so that we are prepared for this type of contingencies that are really in the horizon, or we have just lived through as emergencies. And then again, to support the grant writing processes, just as Jose was saying, and creating those other alliances that are so powerful when you present a grant solicitation, but sometimes we don't even know where to go for these supports, for this seed money. So those would be part of my priorities, but sent surely all towards the students' purposes.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I acknowledge I asked what could be a simple but also a very hard question, because part of it is to prioritize. We know there's significant opportunities on the island and assets as well as needs and balancing it out. And I know that Emily's taking a look. I just quickly looked, there's some really great comments and questions about resources. What does it mean when you're looking at teachers and faculty? And I think there's questions about brain drain. So critical as we think about the opportunity to invest resources, and if we had a magic wand. And I think some of the really challenging trade-offs that institutions and others are having to make about the work they're doing and their resilience overall in order to serve students better, and that students and families and faculty and others are having to make as well. So I appreciate some of the highlights, acknowledging that we're not asking you to address all of it in a significant way. Margarita, I would be remiss to not give you the opportunity to give us that kind of feedback. If you could recommend investments in the educational pathway for students in Puerto Rico, what would you prioritize? I'm sorry, I need to unmute.
Okay. I would look at models that we know have worked, and that have worked in a small scale in Puerto Rico. And I would look at taking them to a larger scale. I'm thinking, for instance, of that marvelous Montessori project, Proyecto Nueva Escuela, o Instituto Nueva Escuela, that Ana Maria Garcia Blanco has been shepherding so wisely and so productively for a number of years. I'm thinking of some of the smaller programs in the arts that have yielded such extraordinary results, because students, once they get engaged whether it is in the arts, whether it is in some kind of applied sciences and so forth, really fall in love with the discipline and can't spend enough time doing it, as opposed to the other possibility of trying to get away from school as quickly as possible. So I think I would conduct a reflection and a conversation in Puerto Rico among educators about what are the programs that have worked in your institution that you think imply a different way of doing things, a productive way of doing things. What has worked with your students? Because also what works in Macau might not work elsewhere, or it might, and it's important to figure out what's the story and what is it that's translatable or reproducible, what needs to happen in a small scale. But I think, there's so much commitment in Puerto Rico and so much intelligence and talent, and so many people who have done wonderful things that we need to look at what has worked and how it can be taken to a different stage. And that's what I would suggest we do with that money that is going to come our way as soon as the program is over.
Yeah, thank you. I so appreciate your responses. I know it was challenging to keep it short. All of them sound engaging. I'd love to go deeper in each one of these. Margarita and I have had the benefit of having a conversation with José and Hilda, but ourselves, that this is a conversation that needs to continue. We would be remiss to have one conversation and think that's going to capture. For many of you, this is kind of Puerto Rico 101, as we sometimes say, and there's so much deeper issues and opportunities to engage with you. So Margarita, Fundación and Excelencia, we're talking about how do we create a series where we can get into some of these conversations and go deeper, and José's point, not just about data, but research and opportunities there. Hilda looking at the institutional resilience, accreditation, the trade-offs of the financial investment and the opportunities institutions must face in trying to make sure that they are available for students. Some of the really great comments and questions that are in the comment section, asking about faculty, asking about Afro-Puerto Ricans, asking about issues of mainland returning to the island and vice versa, brain drain. So grateful that you all are engaging with us and putting them there. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to get to a lot of those questions, but I think the commitment that the Fundación and Excelencia are making to you all is that we want to continue to engage in conversation and bring in those of you who are doing this hard work and struggling with some of the challenges, as well as superseding and being successful in making sure that we are all better educated and can make sure that we're paying attention to Puerto Rico as critical to our understanding and our success in higher education overall, and certainly for Latinos in the US, as well as on the island and elsewhere, everywhere. So one commitment we're making is that we are going to put together a webinar series where we engage in more of these discussions. If you haven't been able to ask your question, please put it in the comment section. We are taking a look at that. We want to make sure that we are interacting and being relevant to you as you think about issues that are important on the island. And second, please know that we are going to continue to collaborate. We want to do case studies on institutional resilience on the island. Folks on the mainland and folks on the island and elsewhere need to know and understand what are some of those hard decisions that are being made about enrollment, financial aid, and faculty and staff, and issues of degree completion and workforce linkages. They are critical, and I think there's a lot that my fellow colleagues here know that we need to better understand and that we need to share, and that we can maybe also influence and support as they go forward with the hard work they're trying to do. So we are grateful that we have the support of Ascendium Education Group that has supported this collaboration between the Fundación and Excelencia to try and take a look at a couple of case studies. We hope you will continue with us as we look to expand this dialogue and engage others in a fruitful and critical conversation about students on the island and what we need to know, the diaspora, and all the elements that make for student success that are critical in understanding who we're serving, who we're not serving, who we intend and need to serve in a more robust way, and who make sure we fulfill their interest and their commitment and the quality education and the dreams they have to get a college education. So thank you all for your time. Please do look for the web the summary of this webinar, and we will post it on our website. Please do follow up with us and our good colleagues, Hilda, Jose, Margarita. Thank you for your time and your knowledge and your continual never-ending commitment to education overall, and certainly on the island. Your contributions are so critical for all of us that need to pay attention to what makes a difference day in and day out. So thank you all. And we look forward to following up with you as we continue this discussion. Take care.